Is that a collection of human skulls you've got above your head as well? Finding a book, Steve?
She's hidden some of my books.
Every now and then I go and tidy them.
Hey everybody, and welcome back to Ask a Depth Psychologist, our monthly podcast series where I bring on, well, so far it's been Steve, who of course, as you guys know, has 40 years worth of clinical experience in depth psychology, but we're also going to be bringing on Steve's wife, which of course is not her claim to fame necessarily. She has just as much experience as Steve does. She is called Pauline, and she's coming on for a bonus episode of this podcast today to answer your questions that you've submitted on Patreon at the $10 tier or higher. So first of all, Pauline, how are you doing?
I'm okay, James. Good to see you again.
Fantastic. And Steve, of course, I don't want to leave you out of this. You've come into you've come into chaperone and supervise because you come from the 1920s, wasn't it?
I'm only here for a cup of tea, don't worry.
Fantastic. All right, so we're just going to jump straight into the questions. As always with this particular podcast, if you look in the pinned comment or the description, you'll be able to see the timestamps. So if you don't want to listen to us ramble on for an hour, however long this happens to be, then you can just take a look to see which specific questions that you would like to see answered. So the first question comes from Nick D, and he asks, when given criticism about oneself from a loved one that we disagree with, how do we know whether we are right to disagree with them, or whether they are right and our ego is just trying to protect itself by blocking, ignoring, or disagreeing with their criticism, which may actually be true? And is it possible that if our partner is a different personality type than both of us, that both of us can disagree with each other about the criticism, but are we both right from the perspective of how we see the world? Now, this sounds like, Nick, you've got quite a confusing wife or a confusing girlfriend. I don't know how to answer that question. Perhaps you can help, Pauline. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, it's a very good question with lots of parts to it. I guess I'd probably start with wondering who it is that's doing the criticism. Maybe, just how conscious or aware of themselves they are themselves. And it's never nice to hear criticism for a start, is it? That's a difficult thing in any relationship. I think it depends on what the intention is behind the comment, and that's difficult to know in such a general question, really.
Sure. So I guess to illustrate, say Steve came to you, and actually no, we're going to use this the other way around. We're going to be nice.
Yes.
If you went to Steve with some criticism, I don't know, he's been too much of an INTP recently, so he's read too many books, made too many movies, or whatever else. How would Steve know then, or what would be the process by which Steve could actually check you? To be like, you're wrong.
Yes. Or
this is actually valid criticism and I should check in myself. Because it's something I've wondered too in my relationship, because I could basically say, you don't understand me. If sort of like, you know what I mean? You don't get me, I'm doing my thing, go away. So are there any sort of rules or general checks or anything else to make sure that that's valid or not valid?
Sure. I think probably one of the best things to do, and sadly it's probably one of the hardest things to do, is to come at it from your own style. Presuming that you know what your own style is, of course, and everybody needs a place to stand. So probably the kind of language that you use, maybe the timing of the comment as well would be important. So, I mean, Steve and I are polar opposites, so we're about as opposite as it's possible to be, just to add a bit of difficulty in there. And it's taken probably a very long time for us both to work on ourselves and develop ourselves and to see where the other person might be coming from. So it doesn't, as Steve I think has said in other videos, it doesn't happen overnight. And I would probably do my best to use the kind of language that I think he would be receptive to. So I'd have to kind of pull away from talking about facts and feelings, or even using that kind of language. So if I was to say to him, well, how are you feeling about things? It might just ignite the situation anyway, if it's already a bit vexed. So I think the kind of language is that you use is probably a good starting point. And that takes time and it takes experience, and you have to check yourself. And, most people have very busy lives and sometimes we don't always get it right. But I think it's just a skill that you hone over time. And it's probably helpful to have some idea of, what types you both are, if it's a kind of a, you know, husband and wife or boyfriend girlfriend type relationship, because at least then you have a place to stand.
Yeah.
Without those tools, it's very, very difficult to know what's going on. And even then, you have to consider other factors, as I suggested before, such as complexes and so on. So I think the kind of language that you use, the way that you address someone, and just be patient with it, because, you know, you may not get it right first time off. It may take weeks, months, years even to really see the best way of you know, understanding someone. And let's face it, we all want to be understood. I mean, that's the beauty of typology, really, is that it can facilitate that. It allows you to have another perspective other than your own.
Yes, it is funny, because I can definitely detect like a contrast. You'd be like, I want to understand you. Maybe for me, I'd be like, I want to socially engineer you, which is kind of like the same thing in and of itself, right? So you mentioned that you'd have to change your approach based on the type of the person. So if they're, say, a feeling type, so F dominant or something, then you would go in with how do you feel? Well,
I think, yes, it would be useful to do that, because obviously for feeling types particularly, and probably in particular extroverted feeling types, you need to warm it up a little bit. If you go in there like a Cyberman, you know, or, you know, you're very TI about it.
This is my problem. This is my problem. You're singing to my soul. I'm the exact type of person to be like, you know, somebody's, you know, they just had a family death or something, and I'd go straight in full TI mode, criticizing them.
Right.
So, yeah.
I mean, obviously, it has its uses. It's incredibly useful. I mean, you know, I've come to admire, you know, INTPs immensely over the years, because I think they're much misunderstood as well, to be honest with you.
Smug mode.
And you know, they're fabulous intellectuals. Usually they have great ideas. They're very, very good at analysing things and taking things apart. I find that Steve's incredibly good in very, very difficult situations, usually big situations that require, they have a lot of difficulty to them. I mean, that's incredibly invaluable. I mean, it's the kind of thing you've just offered, really. I mean, something like a funeral where, you know, there might be a lot of arranging to do, a lot of difficult things to be dealt with. He would be very good at just, you know, organising all of that, as well as being sensitive to maybe the deceased person's wishes and so on. So there's merit in all types, of course there is.
Can I,
yes, of course.
It's a bit different because I have worked on myself, so I'm not really a purely functioning INTP socially. Internally, I keep the INTP flame going because that's my inner world. In terms of relating with other people, though, I've tried to develop my hitherto latent functions.
Yes.
As much sensitivity and feeling as I can for an individual. That's very important to me. That was part of my development as a therapist, was doing that. But defaults, yeah, I'm INTP. And people who know me well see that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, well, they do. I mean, even if you're introverted, obviously it's your extroverted function that people see, because that's how you meet the world. So people who maybe don't know Steve as well will see his extroverted intuition first. And that can facsimile feeling as well, in so much as it appears to be warm and gregarious and outgoing and talkative and what would be another way of describing it, entertaining at times as well. So that can be invaluable in social situations, but it can take its toll too, can't it? Because you can obviously, if it's not your dominant function, it can start to run out and run down quite quickly too. And when that happens, obviously you fall back to your dominant function, which for Steve and yourself will be your introverted thinking.
On that, extroverted intuition facsimiling as extroverted feeling. If I understand that properly in a social context, say Steve is hosting a party and he's very nice to you when you sort of come up to the door, you'd perceive that as being him being a warm-hearted person, when he's actually just sort of watching what you're doing as fast as humanly possible, reaching out to you as an object and adapting based on what he thinks the best possible outcome should be.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's exactly
Okay,
it.
because that does make
Yeah.
you sound like the proper cyber controller, Steve.
But to the uninitiated, it might seem that person is just very warm, and I guess they are. It's just a style difference, isn't it? But there isn't necessarily the engagement with the object or the person in the way that there might be with, say, an extroverted feeling type who is concerned for the well-being of that person and making them feel comfortable, and concerned about how they might be feeling in such a situation and so on. But like I say, to the untrained eye, it can appear to be doing the same kind of job.
Yeah, that's really, really lovely. That's honestly, really, that's really, really lovely.
I am reformed. I know how to feel. I know how to sense other people's feelings and work through them. But as a default type, I would say that's absolutely the case. Extroverted initiation can be very charming as well.
It can, yes.
Well,
yeah.
There you go. There you go. Well, that's why, of course, Steve, I brought you onto these podcasts, of course.
Stopped all that.
He's banging his own drum now.
Absolutely adorable. Before your ego goes to your head, I think we should move on to the next question. So this one comes from Aetherian.
Have we answered that one fully, have we, James?
I think so, yeah.
Yes, okay.
I believe so.
Introverted sensing, I don't know. Wanting to put the full stop.
I just want to make sure that we've covered all bases for that person.
You can follow up with as many essays as you like. Don't worry. It'll be perfectly all right. This one comes from Aetherian, and he asks, this is a deep question. How can you tell if somebody is compatible with you for a lifelong romantic relationship? Put another way, what are the most important characteristics for lifelong romantic compatibility? Solve everybody's love life all at once, Pauline. Go for it.
Well, like I say, we're polar opposites. I can't say that going back, how many years is it?
42.
42 years, that we would necessarily have known that at the beginning.
No, I did. I was already into Jung.
Clever Dicky INTP here, of
47
course.
years of Jung for me.
Well, I wasn't as aware of it as he was, I have to say. But I think over the years I've come to the conclusion probably that what started off as being, because opposites attract and they get into trouble very often, that appear to be difficult is actually probably now a virtue, in so much as it's more stimulating to be with someone who's different to you, although obviously there are times where it's intensely irritating as well. Of course it is. Nonetheless, I think I would still prefer that than if we were both completely the same type, or even if there were, and often this is suggested that it's better to have some similarity and some difference, and obviously that does work for some people, but I think it's assisted the longevity of our relationship, to be honest with you, because there's more to develop, providing that that's what you choose to do in your relationship. It's not for everyone, of course.
I thought you liked me for who I was.
Well, I do now.
I don't know.
No, I do. I jest, of course I do. No, I have. I've really come to admire INTPs in particular because, like I said before, I think they are much maligned, and they have an enormous intellectual capacity. Usually, are often academics, are usually very deeply feeling and very sensitive, but people don't always see that, so they don't know. I think they can be taken advantage of because of that. They're often very, very loyal, and stay in relationships maybe long past, the sell-by date. And so in that sense, they can be taken advantage of. But, I think there's immense value in being different. And I think that's the beauty really of being different, and having an individuation marriage or relationship, is that the potential over time to grow is so much greater. I mean, we've worked with couples who have been very similar, or exactly the same type with respect to Myers-Briggs, and how can I say, very often there's not a lot there to develop. No. I mean, and that's not to say that people who are in that situation can't be happy. but you can see the limitations, you can see the ceiling of the relationship in situations like that. So whilst it might be more difficult initially with someone who's different to you, I think if you stick with it and you work through it, I think it pays dividends in the end.
I like that.
You get a confirmation bias with in relationships where the two people involved are the same, that they will anticipate the other on the basis of their own confirmation bias. So there's a little dialogue, whereas the difference may seem to be irritating sometimes because it's completely different. Two people who are exactly the same will feel or think that they understand the other far more than they do, when really they're just projecting themselves and their own issues and their own personal complexes, and they run out of adaptability very quickly, or they can do. So it's not a general statement as such, it's just an observation that can happen, can't it?
Yes, it can. And I think where it does happen too, it's a bit like, if I think of sort of our family as a whole, I would say that my daughter, for example, who is nearly 20 now, she's actually learning disabled. But in terms of her personality type, she's probably similar to myself. And my son, who's 25, or our son who's 25, is probably more similar to you in style. And I actually find personally that sometimes things grate more with my daughter, our daughter Rhiannon, than they do with Gareth, because we're so similar. Whereas with Gareth, it's more complementarity, I guess. And so there's in some ways less room for friction in some areas where there is that difference. So I think it's important not to see that as being bad, or as something which is going to undermine your relationship, and therefore is a bad thing, and maybe you should think about looking for someone who's more similar to you in terms of their style. It's just a more positive and productive way, I think, of looking at something which is, essentially different to you.
Yeah, it's talking to you about this type of thing, Pauline, is actually really, it's taking me back to, I don't know how many years ago, but a long time ago, because obviously I've been like a science nerd for like forever. So as soon as I could, I would break from everybody else in school and I'd sit with the science nerds. And it's interesting, up to this day, everyone in the Discord except maybe one is an intuitive type. So the way we will interact, so even the way a Furian's question was raised is like, what are the traits? It's like dun 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 dun. And you've come out with more of a, well, it depends what makes people happy, and there's like differences. It's more of a flowy, dancey way of doing things. So almost the question's answered. Of course, you've answered it with your own words, but almost the way you answered it is how you answer the question in kind of like a strange way. But I do want to ask a very NT question, I guess. You've got the whole
You're testing me now, aren't you, James? Yeah.
Well, I do wonder this actually, because
to see how developed my animus is. Yeah, thank you for that.
Well, you've got masculine men, you've got feminine women, which is the old adage, right? It goes back through all of time, and of course you can also get feminine men and masculine women. Is this Myers-Briggs stuff in relation to relationships a way of explaining why masculine men and feminine women has been the central unit of the family, rather than everybody just being the same? If you see what I mean.
I think I do. The thing about the Myers-Briggs is that you find statistically that most men are thinking types, and most women are feeling types. So there tends to be a correlation between men and thinking and women and feeling, although it can be the other way around, of course.
Yeah.
Probably a good example of it would be Joe and Jane Wheelwright, who are long since deceased now. Oh, sorry.
No, carry on. Yeah. Got to get the book off.
Okay. And they had difficulties. Thank you.
We'll see if that's picked up. What's that? St. George and the Dandelion by Joseph B. Wheelwright.
That's right. Yes. Yeah.
Cool.
They were brilliant in typology.
Oh, they
Fantastic.
were. Yeah. Yeah. But they, as you might imagine, they started off having difficulties in the relationship, where basically, they couldn't make sense of one another. And I think had they not had the typology, had they not, to use their own words, had tools to work with, then their marriage would have been compromised, and they probably would have, separated and divorced and so on. Now, if we come on to sort of their particular types, then Joe Wheelwright was a feeling type, and his wife Jane was Jane, strangely enough, a sensing type. She did the sensing and the thinking in the relationship, and he did the intuiting and the feeling in the relationship.
And he was
So,
extroverted,
and
she was
yes,
introverted as well.
That's right. Yes. So sorry, Steve. No, go on, lovely.
They were the opposite way round,
yes,
if you like.
That you might expect conventionally.
The TV series Young, The Wisdom of the Dream, which is on YouTube, you can see them being interviewed. And the way Joe Wheelwright puts it is that basically, in effect, he had a typically feminine.
Yes.
I saw that. Yeah.
He had a masculine one.
Yes.
But it was the other way around within the relationship, and that caused a problem. But Jung sorted them out.
Good.
Yeah.
Well, the way my mum has always described these things to me is she's like, James, you're very male. You're very male. You're just like your dad, and I'm very female. And then when Jane comes up, she's very female too. So it must be my mum's an ESFJ. I'm pretty sure. I don't know what my dad is. He typed as an INTJ. I really don't think so. But there's definitely the feeling thinking divide between them. So when she's described exactly as you said, she's described my dad and me very male thinking, and then my Jane and her as feeling types. So I guess that does make sense. It must be where that sort of comes from. But of course, so you would describe with for example Joe Wheelwright there, he would be the more feminine one in the relationship in that sense, would he? If I heard that correctly.
Well, psychologically speaking, in terms of his typology.
When he got his diploma off Jung, as he calls it, this is how he recounts it anyway. The first thing Carl Jung said to him is, go and get a degree in medicine. It'll sort your thinking out, because all over the place.
Yes.
Basically, he was an F type, and he thought, no, you have to deal with something that will, or find something that will force you to think properly. Go and study medicine before you study analysis. And then he went to the house in Kusnacht. Jung was in the garden, and he approached him to receive his diploma, and Jung was just sat there ignoring him. And he said he was there like a puppy dog waiting to be approved of because of his feeling and intuition. And Jung was just ignoring him completely. And then he handed him the diploma and said, when you go back to America, if everybody loves you, it'll be a disaster. And then he said, goodbye, Wheelwright, and just lifted up the newspaper. And that was it. Off he went, and he slunk along, looking back, hoping he would be called back to the master. But he didn't call him back. He wanted to say to him, you can't function in such a one-sided way as you have been functioning. Okay, you've put the work in, we'll qualify you, but you have to develop that other side of you. And he took it in such good faith.
Yes, he did.
He did. Was really,
absolutely,
really good
he did.
It's worth watching.
It is worth watching. I believe another issue that he had whilst he was studying medicine, which again probably shows something of the sort of the NS difference, is that at first he was reluctant to touch people in order to make a diagnosis. And again, you see the sort of the NS divide there, whereas sensing types are probably more likely because they're interested in data and sensory things as well, that he was kind of reluctant to do it. So it's like, well, how can you make a diagnosis if you're not prepared to touch someone? Which again is just a style difference, isn't it? And maybe, he went more on hunches and intuition and so on, but it was something that he had to develop in himself, both in his medical practice, but obviously also in his relationship to Jane as well.
So I guess the answer, Aetherian, if I can sum it up, is develop, balance out, and hopefully you can do the same thing with your significant other at the same time, I guess. So So to move on to question number 3, this comes from, what is your name, my friend? Bewilderone. Bewildered One. I am very silly. And Bewildered One asks, I have consistently typed differently. INFP, INTP, and INFJ. How often do you see type changes, and why? So his I and his N seem to be constant there. So why do you think?
Right. Well, again, if I was to apply it to ourselves, and it's taken again, a lot of time. I'm probably doing the test a number of times and so on. But we found for ourselves that some things are consistent. So my S and F have been consistent over time, and Steve's N and T have been consistent over time. INE and P and J, with respect to the Myers-Briggs, of course, if we're talking about that, have changed. And so, you know, I think you do typically get this. I don't think there's anything strange about that. I think it's useful to look at other things as well, if that's happening, such as complex activity, for example. So, or maybe, you know, even when and where you're doing it, you know, the context in which you're doing it. So it's probably useful to look at other factors as well that might actually be, you know, contributing to those changes. But it's probably always best to start with those things that have consistency. And to say, well, that's, you know, that seems to stay the same, that's not altering. And maybe look at other factors, you know, to understand more broadly what might be happening. Although having said that, you know, the more you do the test, the more savvy you get. And if you're not careful, you can kind of trick yourself into things as well. I think you have to be careful of doing that. Sorry, Steve, go on.
It's a useful compass. But you do have to set it aside. And this is one reason why I suggested yesterday that the more complicated the approach to typology, the less likely it is to be of any functional use at all. And in support of that, I would quote Jung himself, who said that, well, he never did type testing. They're useful only for beginners. And that everything should be based on observation. And Pauline is particularly good at observation. If she just talks to somebody or watches them or any combination of the two, she can predict what the answer will be very, very reliably on the Myers-Briggs, for example. Now that might suggest that Myers-Briggs and the observation co-confirm one another, but she wouldn't need disproves the Myers-Briggs at all, because she can just type someone simply by talking to them and observing them. So at that point, you don't need the type tests. And you lose the errors that come in the issues over test retest validity with Myers-Briggs. There are good reasons why that happens, by the way. It doesn't invalidate the test. It's because of the way the construct validity of Myers-Briggs is put together. That means the criticism of its retest reliability is itself invalid. But we could perhaps discuss that another time.
I mean, it's actually an indicator on the test as well. I think that's an important thing to mention. So, you know, MBTI, the I meaning indicator. So in like Steve says, it's really just to try and get a compass on things. And you can't look at it in isolation. I think to do that would be wrong. And you start to get into sort of the realm of almost using it like a horoscope or something, you know, such similar thing, which would be a shame, really. But I think ultimately, you have to rely on what you experience empirically with people. And I certainly, just to go back to sort of the question, I think it's a very valuable question, because you do see this, you do see some things persist over time, and you do see some things alter. And it's where things are different that it becomes interesting. And then you have to employ other methods to maybe, you know, you might get into word association or free association or some other method in order to uncover what else might be going on. Plus, it's also difficult doing something like this in this way, because as Steve rightly says, you're with someone and you're in a protected space, and all the nuances of that relationship are there, which you don't have when you just try to answer somebody's question, or coldly really, and in a kind of a general sort of way. So I'd like to kind of be able to answer it more fully than that, but it's difficult to without having more detail, I would say.
So I guess Bewildered One, or anyone else who's interested in having your type done, but maybe you're struggling, you're not quite sure if the test is right, or if indeed you just want it done as quickly as possible and confirmed, both Steve and Pauline are actually offering over on the Patreon at the Dyad consultation tier an ability for you to sit down, have a chat, maybe get a coffee, probably be a nice idea. Have a chat, and then one of them will actually be able to type you straight away. And from experience, I think, Pauline, it was the first thing you ever said to me, I think, was we were in a WhatsApp group, and you said, you're an INTP, I'll bet money on it. And I think it was the very first thing you said.
I might have that somewhere on my phone. Yes.
That was the very first thing, and I remember bringing Jane to see both of you two, and like you spoke to Jane for like 2 minutes, and then she left the room for something. You were like, ISFJ. It's like if you can't turn it off or something, it's good. It's good.
It's very sad, isn't it?
No, it's good. Very, very, very useful. Either to relate to people as you do, or socially engineering as I do. So we got next question here comes again from Nick D, and Nick D asks, as most of us are intuitives, from where does that trait come from in a Jungian model? Is someone who is more dominant in one part of their psyche or prefers an archetype or something leads to the differences in personality types? So so basically what's the general basis for intuition, if you have any idea? I've no idea.
It's innate, that isn't it?
Yeah.
Your type is innate, and that can get reinforced or suppressed during life. And I think this is one of the things that Pauline was mentioning, that without knowing the background of someone, you can't know whether their manifest type is their true type or intended type.
Yeah.
Within a family, for example, if you have, as happened in my family, 3 sensing types, my mother and father were both sensing types.
Yes.
I'm a brother.
Yes.
And they're all severely introverted.
Yes.
That even though I was introverted, I appeared off the scale extroverted compared to them. I could have maladapted myself and suppressed my intuition. I didn't, and thank goodness I didn't, because they had this capacity to instantly hibernate, didn't they? They could just switch off and go to sleep, and it's like the whole house with the energy would just go down, because there was so little extroversion, and all the sensing was introverted. Then
you had to recharge, though, James.
Oh, they did that. Yes, they did that. And I was just happily burn out. But I was overcompensating for them.
Even the dog. Even the dog was that way.
We had this huge long-haired German Shepherd, and it would just go straight down.
Yeah. When it comes to when Jane's tired, so she's has she got introverted sensing? I know she's got sensing. Is it introverted? Yeah.
Yes, but if she's and then this is an important difference too, because she may be functioning as an ISFJ. Doesn't mean she is one. She could be an ESFJ, but again, the context in which she finds herself right now may be, more conducive to her being an ISFJ. So with ISFJ, you've still got extroverted feeling, but the introverted sensing is dominant. Yes.
Yeah. Well, she when she gets tired, she'll just go to sleep, basically.
Yes.
When if I get tired, it will either be absolute exhaustion and then I'll have to sleep, or otherwise it's like, let me have a dance party first, or let me finish all of this other stuff first.
Why not? Why not exhaust yourself more? Yes.
Yeah, and if I try and get Jane to join in, she's like, no, I'm going to bed. She's already brushed her teeth or whatever. She's got her pajamas on, and she goes to bed. I'm like,
it's all laid out, and Yeah,
it's all very, very, very strange to me. These sensing types. It's just very, very strange to me.
It'll become familiar with time, though, James. It will.
Yeah.
And then you'll see the value of it in your own life.
Yeah.
And vice versa. So. Yeah, and vice versa.
Oh, so in other words, I should calm down, and Jane should also join in with the dance parties then, basically.
Yes.
Good.
Yeah, that's the deal, isn't it? That's the deal you make.
Well, that's fantastic. I hope she's watching this right now.
You need to forgive someone for being different.
Yes.
That's really important. It's part of my live and let live philosophy. If you forgive someone for being different, you can then learn from them and allow them to compliment you. And of course, the secondary payoff of that is that if you forgive an ESFJ as an INTP for being different, that means you let them run as an ESFJ and they leave you alone to be an INTP. Yeah. So live and let live means you don't necessarily have to develop everything all at once. You can still be who you are.
Oh, yes.
And
you should.
You don't kind of even out into this flat equilibrium state amongst the various types. You just respect the ESFJ and let them do what they do really well. Learn from them, but keep your integrity as an INTP.
I like that.
It's the best. For INTPs, that's definitely the best approach.
Yeah, it's all worked out, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
I mean, having met Jane, she's gorgeous. She's got a stillness about her.
Yeah,
which
she does.
It's lovely. It has a calming effect instantly. And that's good to be around. It's good to be around, particularly if you're exhausted or you're ill, for example.
Yes, you're right. You're absolutely right. Yeah.
I mean, I have well, actually, it's, I was going to say a friend, but she was previously a patient who is an INFP, life and soul of the party, gets exhausted very, very easily. And over the years has had a lot of difficulty relating to a mum. Because a mum is probably, I would imagine, an ISFP or an ISFJ, one of those two. And there's been a lot of tension between them. But one thing she has said, and I've seen it over and over again, is that whenever she's ill, a mum's the person she goes to, because a mum will care for her. She won't overstimulate her. She'll kind of understand what her needs are without even having to say. And there's huge value in that. Huge value in that.
Yeah, it is actually huge. It's useful to know, like joking about whatever else, or you silly sensing types, whatever else. It's so useful because I really don't want to date myself in a way. It's like if I had to date, say, Steve, it'd be like, why?
It, James?
Yeah, it would.
My mother was an ISFP.
She was, yes.
And she was a very, how do I describe her? She was not medieval.
Medieval,
yes. She was not of the 20th and 21st centuries. She could have walked out the back door into the medieval period and just gone turnip picking.
No problem, yeah.
And she wouldn't have noticed. But that gave her a great deal of adaptability. During the Second World War, she would be walking through Liverpool at night with bombs dropping all around her.
Yes.
And her best friend was hiding in a doorway, climbing the wall with utter terror. And to me, mum, it was just, oh, look at that flash, oh, the bright light, it was like that. And these were bombs.
Yes. Yeah.
She just didn't really care.
Well, she probably just didn't give too much energy to it.
No,
because there's a certain amount of what can you do about it?
Yeah.
It's a fact. It's happening.
Yes.
Life goes on.
And that's the extroverted sensing, which although she was introverted, feeling dominant, that's what you met, was this steadiness. But I'll say the shadow side of that type in her was crippling, because it was like a deep receding cave, with some unknown feeling quality that was at the back of this cave that you couldn't quite reach. I mean, if you crossed the line with her, and you didn't know you had, that's how you were punished, was the complete withdrawal.
Yes.
And some very, very deep inner judgment. And she seemed to me to be part of the landscape, like she lived in trees, not like a simian would, but like a spirit would. And somehow was part of the procession of the seasons, because where I lived was just backed over open countryside, and there was a river at the bottom of the garden, and she just seemed to be part of all of that. Whereas my dad was a different kind of sensing type. He was very much orientated towards the physicality of the world, and he had very little manifest imagination at all. I did all the imagining for everyone.
You did, for the whole family.
For the whole family, but my mum seemed to be able to understand that, or at least give me the impression that she did. And it was really her who got me into what I've done all my life, passively. Yeah. She only gave a bit of encouragement, but it was sufficient to give shape and direction to what I was doing. And this falls back on the anima thing again. Like, the mother for a young man is the prime imprinter of your experience of the anima. So sensing and feeling to me have always been synonymous with femininity. And the mystery of being feminine. Yeah. So you definitely appreciate that. In a typological sense, that's how that impacted me.
Yeah, I had a friend like your mother. I think you're saying it was your mother, the one who would just walk or something down the street when there were bombs going off or something, right? Yeah. I did have a friend he was a strange guy, but I was really attracted to him for some reason, not sexually, But we'd walk into, there was one time we went into town or something on a lunch break, and we were like rushing to try. I was trying to rush to get there. We had like an hour lunch break, and this place was 45 minutes away. We had to come back again, and he was like, "No, let's just walk, man. Let's just chill." But he was also a scientist at the same time. But he was utterly relaxed, always in his environment. Before he'd sit down, he'd make sure that the seat was all comfy first, almost like a cat with a pillow. do that, and he'd
Yeah.
relax, and he'd
In
eat
the
his food
moment.
slowly, yeah, and he'd look you in the eyes when he spoke. I really like you. You're really nice. Maybe because you're the complete opposite to me. I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Oh, so you're
There's
not
your
nice.
shadow.
You're not nice then, Jay. It's the complete opposite to you, but you're not nice. Of course you are.
Well, Nick's asked a couple more quickfire questions, if that's all right.
Yes, of course.
So maybe 1, 2, 3, 5 sentences, however much. Is Myers-Briggs Jungian, or is it just a useful framework to understand something more complex?
Well, it's not mainstream Jung. It's a simple answer to that. It was never endorsed by Carl Jung. Nothing ever was in that sense. So it's not mainstream Jungian. Does it model Jung's typology as laid out in Psychological Types? Yes. Yes, cool. It does, without a doubt. Although it's kind of bifurcated, if you like, in the sense that the Gray wheelwright test, which is the wheelwrights again, and another chap called Gray, they took one emphasis that Jung made in Psychological Types, and the Myers-Briggs took another, which seemed to contradict one another. So that's where there's that slight difference. But yeah, overall, you can say it is Jungian, but it's not part of the mainstream.
Gotcha. That makes sense. And do either of you have any thoughts on Socionics, which is the former Soviet version of Myers-Briggs, which has the irrational-rational dimension?
I mean, my view, which you might say, well, she would say that being an ESFJ, is that sometimes in these things you can over elaborate in terms of the kind of ideas and people producing very complex models to do with typology. Personally, I prefer to just strip it back. And sometimes even abandon the Myers-Briggs, because Jung himself talked about pure types.
Yes.
And sometimes you do find that sometimes it's not possible to say more than, for example, that you can see that somebody's extroverted, or you could see that they're highly intuitive, or they have a reliance on facts and are possibly a sensing type. Sometimes you can do no more than that. Sometimes you can't actually create a profile for someone in an MBTI way. So I think that's important to bear in mind as well. It's nearly always what you experience empirically that matters, even more than a test or an indicator.
Gotcha. That makes perfect sense. Were you finding a book, Steve?
She's hidden some of my books.
Every now and then I go and tidy them.
I think some of them are actually hers, and I borrowed them actually, and she just takes them back. But the one I was looking for was the Single Loomis.
Oh yes.
Inventory of Personality, SLIP, SLIP. And there's another one here, which is Angelo Spoto's, which is another development of
Dancing the Wheel of Psychological Types. Is that the one you meant? That's
so in case that doesn't come up on the screen, this is Jung's Typology in Perspective by Angelo Spoto.
That's it, yeah.
I have pinched the other one, by the way.
Yes. Okay.
But you said you didn't like it particularly.
Right, all right. Calm down.
Do you want me to guess it for you?
No, we'll check the table.
Okay.
Okay. Well, that's the Single Loomis Inventory of Personality, and the book is called Dancing the Wheel of the Psychological Types.
Yes.
By June, and is it Mary Loomis?
I think it is.
June Singer and Mary Loomis.
Yeah.
But there's lots of different variants, and some of these tests that they push are really, really complicated. And I agree with Pauline on this, that sometimes there are pure types.
Yeah.
But we tend to settle on the Myers-Briggs because for me it's a null hypothesis.
Yeah.
I start with that and say I have to be able to reject this to get beyond it, and can I actually reject this in a clinical setting working with someone, or is it sufficient? And if it's sufficient, I don't bother to go to any of the other variants on the type test. I'll stick with it and then move off from it. But that's an INTP way of doing things, isn't it?
Very, very much so. Yeah. I mean, we've sometimes used the Myers-Briggs or, deliberately asked someone to imagine that maybe a significant person in their life or another part of them is answering the test. So we've tried to be flexible about its use as well, rather than just, and I think particularly where you've got somebody who isn't naive to the test. mean, when you do it for the first time, you know, you're pretty much sort of dealing with raw data, but the more into it they get, and given that complexes are crafty things, you have to be as crafty back, and sometimes, you know, we'll utilize it in that way.
That was Pauline's innovation, that she would get, where we were working with couples, she would get the husband to type the wife and answer as the wife, and then compare it with the wife's.
Interesting.
Or say, well, what do you think your husband or wife's shadow is? How would you type that and do it? And we'll get another angle in a structured way, because people do appreciate structure sometimes, don't they, rather than a more loose approach. But Pauline pioneered that, didn't you, when we were working at Clawton Medical Centre?
Well, yes, I think it just gives flexibility to something, doesn't it, really, that would otherwise be quite restricting, and certainly wouldn't answer some of the questions that you presented today about, well, you know, why does my type, you know, continually change, or something stay the same, some things change. So you've got to kind of be forensic about it. I guess.
Well done on pioneering that thing. Jane accidentally did that for me when I first met her when I was 18. The first, because she loves Harry Potter or whatever, and there's a line in Harry Potter, I probably told you to before, it says you have the emotional range of a teaspoon, is something someone says in one of the films. One of the first things she said to me was like, you have the emotional range of a teaspoon. In other words, that's your shadow behind you. And I can return some shadow things back to her again, and then with her feelings, she goes, that's not very nice. That's so mean to me. Stop it.
Well, I've actually found, probably particularly with Steve, is that he's, you know, when he does sort of engage his anima, his ESFJ anima, that he's intensely feeling, sometimes too much. You know, I kind of see an exaggerated version of myself, and I'm sort of, you know, you can be a bit appalled by it. It's like, oh my, for God's sake, rein it in. You're just being too nice.
Yes.
It's going to get you into trouble.
I know what you mean.
Do you know what I mean?
I do.
Yeah. So we'll go and be, you know, particularly nice to the guy who delivers the tea, whereas normally the INT approach would be, you know, a bit like how you are with, dare I say it?
Maybe not.
No. Some other people who come knocking, they would get short shrift, basically. And then on other occasions, he'll be effusive, and I think, oh my God, what's going on? You've lost the plot completely. So sometimes you see a kind of exaggerated version of yourself in the other person when you see those functions being used. Third function, shall we say? Yes,
if I get into a particularly heated debate with Jane, she comes out as me and I come out as her, actually, which is really interesting. I'll start, you know, I'll have like my tears in the eyes, and I'll stare at her from across the room, and I'll be like, you know, I'll go doom and gloom or whatever, and then she'll be like, I don't think you're thinking about it properly. You're normally a very rational person. You're not being very rational today. We actually swap. It happened fairly recent. I was like, wait a minute, are you an INTP now? She's like, at least I know what that means now. Yes, this is terrifying.
Absolutely, because obviously, you know, your opposite functions are attached to your anima or your animus. So wherever you get anima-animus conflict going on, you know, you'll get the opposite types employed, shall we say. It can be entertaining, to say the least, can't it?
It's good fun.
For movies, that, James, isn't it? It's like the way you described it then. It was like a scene from a movie.
Looking at all the books she's pinching off me. Terrible.
They've migrated to the corner of the room.
Absolutely.
See, I know everything I have in those piles. That's the thing, James.
Well, I know
absolutely everything.
You did. And is that a collection of human skulls you've got above your head as well?
Paleoanthropological. That one's a Neanderthal. Gareth did that.
So some of our home education.
Home education
with Gareth. Yeah.
That was because of a professor, wasn't it? What was her name? Laura Bishop, Professor Laura Bishop from Yale, a paleoanthropologist who was giving our son some private lessons at Liverpool Museum and in John Moores University when he was, how old, 9, 10?
Yes, he was only very young.
Because he made all these anatomically perfect paleoanthropological skulls as demonstrators for
He's
the
a good
museum.
artist.
He's a very good artist.
He's a good artist, yeah.
He just got bored of it.
In typical INTP fashion, yes.
Moved on to other things. And...
I enjoyed helping him, but I don't think he enjoyed it very much.
No.
Yeah,
That's the ESFP.
can definitely
yeah.
appreciate things growing boring after a while. I absolutely can, unless it completely and utterly sucks me in, I guess. But we have another question here from Nick D,
Yeah.
and this is a different type of question, so maybe it's more geared towards Steve. But
Okay.
it's a chicken and the egg question, old Nick.
Oh dear.
And Nick asks, if the symbols in the Bible are just a documentation in narrative form of the symbols that humans had slowly discovered over the aeons, so is that the case? Or are the symbols used in the Bible becoming part of the collective psyche over thousands of years, and that's why they show up? And Nick says, I suspected the first, but it doesn't explain why different cultures have different symbols. So maybe we could rephrase this and literally say, why do different cultures arrive at different symbols?
Has this got anything to do with typology?
No, it does not. But Nick is a nice young man, and he's asked a nice question.
Yeah, sure. It's a great question. Well, actually, I think it's probably both, unless you want to take a religious perspective, in which case you narrow down your options for an answer there. You'd have to answer from within a Christian biblical tradition.
Oh yeah, let's just tackle it psychologically. Forget that religion is considered a real thing.
I would say that the symbol came first. And then over time it became embedded within that particular culture as represented by that particular faith. And then as that spread out, particularly through the West, then it's become part of the collective unconscious.
So one will reinforce the other.
Yeah.
Okay.
If that answers that.
It does,
yeah. With respect to why there are different symbols in different cultures.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah.
I think yes. Yeah.
Well, I'll give an answer which is based on what Jung himself said. The East, and for him, China was the most far eastern of all Eastern cultures. In his day, he thought that symbols that arose from the Orients, the Chinese Orients, in a Westerner, meant that you were pretty close to being at the bottom of the collective psyche for a Westerner because it was so different. Now Jung wrote a lot of stuff, a lot of forwards, the I Ching, for example, on the Bhagavad Gita, some of the first essays on Zen Buddhism introduced to the West. He wrote forwards for those and interpretations for. So he was at the cutting edge, if you like, of this crossover psychologically between East and West. But now, since the 60s, with this massive explosion through the hippies and through interest in Buddhism and Tantra, Oriental martial arts and so forth, we know a lot more than we did. And I think now that Eastern symbolism that turns up in a Westerner is just as likely to be superficial as it is to be deep. And my personal solution to that was to look at history. I was involved very heavily, still am, with Chinese culture since the age of 16. And I'm 63 now, so that's been a long time. And I found it difficult to bridge unless I literally became absorbed by them. And I was considered an indoor disciple of various Chinese families, which was a great honour. But in order to really reach there, I looked back to history and I said, well, when in the past has a Western culture interacted with an Oriental culture? And that's the Hellenistic era.
Yep.
That's Alexander and India. And I found that was the easiest bridge because the crossover between Greek culture and Indian culture was so mutually cross-fertilizing. In fact, statues of Buddha in Afghanistan were Greek togas. Heracles or Hercules turns up as a Buddhist guardian. The god Indra turns up as Zeus for the Greeks. And so for me, that was the bridge. I had to then understand or try to understand India before I went back and looked at China. And then I had a completely different perspective on it because I found that place to stand between the West and between the East. And then I found that Jung did a lot of that as well in great depth. And I found plenty of contemporary Jungian authors who were Indians and into Hinduism who'd also done the same thing. So I guess really look at history and then you'll see a kind of mirror for the history of our own psyche and how we've used the symbols. So look back to the Hellenistic era, look back at the 1960s, which is now history culturally, look at what the hippies were doing, look at the syncretism between East and West, and then you'll get a perspective on where we stand now to how these symbols are being used.
Nice. Well, I hope that answers your question.
Okay, sorry if
Nick.
that was a bit... Yeah.
No. Really good. Good job. We've got a few more questions. These come from Balderbrock this time. Thank you, my friend. And Balderbrock asks, this is on typology again, of course. He says, if one is chronically stuck in one of the introverted function loops, NIFI in my case, how would one go about getting out? And he's given sort of his own running commentary. He says, therapeutically talk with someone about the ideas ruminating in your mind. Seems like a silly answer, but in doing so, you would directly engage with TE or FE, assuming that is your auxiliary function. So maybe there is something to the cliche, after all. What do you think?
Well, where's he coming from? And what's the model of typology that's influenced him?
So I would guess, knowing Balderbrock and knowing the general audience, this is probably C.S. Joseph style Myers-Briggs.
Okay.
Oh gosh, right.
Well, with all due respect to C.S. Joseph, I wouldn't go there because I do believe it to be an overcomplication, and it would be better to stick with the Myers-Briggs itself because it will simplify what you see.
Yes. And
then from that, simplify even more again, based on the likes of the grey wheelwright and then Jung's pure types.
So you've never come across an introverted function loop before, basically, in your line of work?
I would disregard the concept of it completely. I don't think it's got any mileage in the real world outside of the very narrow focus
okay.
that C.S. Joseph gives it. And it's fine, it works for him. I would not find it any use at all, and I wouldn't go there. I spent
it sounds like he's harming himself with it, actually. Which is
Balderbrook. We spent around 35 years using type tests of various kinds, and before we had access to them, we just had to go on Jung's pure typology. So I would argue that's an awful lot of experience within which you have to trim away a lot of the waste. And when I see somebody building a model which elaborates on stuff that should be trimmed away, I'm thinking that's perhaps an overcompensation for a lack of experience with people. Broad enough setting, and a broad enough setting for us is clinical because you get a complete bandwidth of everything thrown at you and you have no choice what walks in through the door. And an overcomplicated model, then it's just too much. And for me, I would just say get shut. So,
well, it's going to make some... It's going to encourage rumination.
Yes.
For example, if somebody has a tendency towards that anyway, and they're doing their damnedest to work out who they are and where they stand and so on, it's just going to feed it. That would be my concern, that it's actually, it could be harmful to do it in that way. So some clarification really on the question would be helpful.
Sure. Yeah, well, perhaps we can actually reverse engineer this. Maybe we can have a little window into Balderbrock here, because obviously the problem, Balderbrock, you are dealing with is obviously you're ruminating about ideas, and you seem to have hinted that you have NI and FI. Is there a type that has? I know Balderbrock, you'll be intuitive and you will be introverted and you will be intuitive. Is there a type which has NI in their ego and FI in their anima?
That's a good question.
Because I can't remember off the top of my head.
Well, to me that just sounds like a confusion.
It does.
I think he should do the ordinary Myers-Briggs.
Yes, I'd agree with that.
And then talk to someone who knows what they're talking about, and then on the basis of that, we'll get some indication of what he needs to do. But the worst thing you could do is overcomplicate things because you just get stuck in paradoxes. This is an apparent paradox. And whereas intelligence is supposed to be able to deal with paradoxes and hold opposite views simultaneously, that's one of the hallmarks of intelligence. It's also the hallmark of a trap, a cognitive trap as well. Particularly if someone's suffering in whatever way, you don't want to get them locked in a logic loop, which is just reinforcing itself because they are bright, they are intelligent.
Oh, absolutely.
But they're stuck with a paradox that can't be solved because there is no theoretical base to support it. So clear the decks, be very simple about it, and then build complexity in afterwards, if it's needed.
Yes.
I would suggest,
Yeah. I mean, I could almost feel myself, to be honest with you, shutting down at the prospect of having to understand, what this poor guy is asking, really. Which suggests, I mean, it's almost like a psychological infection. It is possibly because of my extroverted feeling. I'm concerned about connections to people and how they might be troubled. It's like,
That's interesting. That's a good way to answer it as well. It's like you've given the game away in the form you've asked the question. In terms of that, it's the wrong question to ask, and there's something underneath it which is causing you to want to ask this. That's clever.
Absolutely.
That's clever.
Yeah, and if I was to allow myself to pursue it, I'd end up as confused as him probably. Whereas if I was actually face to face with somebody, then I would put that aside, and I think, like Steve said, we get back to square one and get him properly typed and so on, and just strip everything away, pare everything back, and just simplify things. Otherwise you just feed the rumination.
Complexity arises from simplicity. That's the way the universe works. So if you go immediately to complexity, you tend to get to a point when suddenly everything breaks down, and you're now on the entropic downslope of understanding rather than building things up. So go towards simplicity first, clarify what it is you're dealing with,
what you're asking,
and then see if it goes in the direction of the complexity or it just simplifies out, and then you find out what's really going on.
Gotcha. I like that. Well, Balderbrock has a PS question, and this is he asks, is there any utility in a typological approach versus just diving straight into individual complexes? Perhaps I can answer this question immediately. Typology is incredibly useful to identifying perhaps which potential complexes you might have in the first place, considering you're going around, depending on your ego attitude, essentially. But what do you two think?
Do you want to answer that, or shall I? Or?
Well, you go first.
I'll kick off with one thing. A Myers-Briggs profile, if it's accurate, and this is relating it back to complexes, will give you an indication of how a person is likely to fracture under pressure. In that sense, it's complementary to an understanding of their complexes. If the Myers-Briggs result is not accurate, then no, it's not very helpful. But except in the sense that it not being accurate will be apparent, and you can then work out what the true type is, and that will help you to solve the complexes that way. So it's a simple but nuanced and very serious way of looking at things, which takes quite a bit of experience and, dare I say it, skill. It has to be said. Whereas if you just use typology superficially, or you just go off into this complex series of ramifications, you're not going to make anything clear.
So basically the idea would be, Balderbrock, if you're trying to fix one of your complexes or uncover a complex, doing a typological test like Myers-Briggs will be very useful to you if you do it properly and you're ensuring that you are doing it properly. Okay.
Absolutely. Can I give you an example? Extroverted intuition lends itself to hysteria. I mentioned what hysteria was yesterday.
That'll be in the Shadow podcast in case these go up in different orders.
But basically, it can lend itself to an over-identification with an object. By an object, it's anything or any person outside of your own field, your psychological field. And if you over-adapt to them, that means they're also reciprocally over-adapting to you, albeit passively. It's like a gravitational field. If you get in relationship as a mass, say a planet to another planet, it's a reciprocal interaction. So as you go towards them, then that gravitational field will reciprocally interact. So they're affecting you on the inside as well as the outside, and that's a problem for extroverted intuition if there's not sufficient consciousness around to see what's going on, and then you get a typical fracture pattern in someone based on being that way, and certain characteristic complexes are much more likely to appear and become a problem because of that over-adaptation. That's just an example based on extroverted intuition.
Gotcha.
Of how you could map that onto complexes and onto psychodynamics in general.
Gotcha. Well, that makes perfect sense, and that's the end of the questions. So I want to say, first of all, thank you to you two for joining me today. Appreciate it.
Thank you, James. Good to see you again.
Thank you.
And to the audience, this was a bonus episode of Ask a Depth Psychologist. Basically, we wanted you all to meet Pauline, basically, and you've done a fantastic job, so thank you, Pauline. You'll be back on in the future, I'm sure, and I'm sure people will be nice to you in the comments down below. If you would like a chance to ask either Steve, Pauline, or myself, for what it's worth, a question, you can sign up at Patreon at the $10 tier or higher, or indeed, if you want to chat with either Steve and Pauline, either for typology or just to hang out, or for any other kind of consultation, maybe something's on your mind, that option's also up there on Patreon under the Dyad consultation tier. So with that out of the way, thank you everybody. Thank you, Stephen, Pauline.
Thank you, James.
Thanks, everyone.